the swaying deck of the drifting drug submarine, alone with the one person I could not stand, her pistol drawn to protect me. We were dressed identically, two women in dark blue coveralls, black boots, bright orange life jackets, dust masks, and bulletproof vests. Lauren's pistol was pointed into the blue handmade Colombian submarine. I was crouched next to her on top of the sub, rough fiberglass pressing into my knee like gravel through my thin coveralls. My eyes searched the opening of the vessel for movement. Lauren yelled in English, pitching her voice deeper so it would carry, the words slightly muffled by her mask. "This is the United States Coast Guard! Come out with your hands up!" She repeated the command in Spanish. Staring into the dark, Lauren leaned over the hatch, looking for the silhouette of a body. 4 men had surrendered themselves the night before, but we didn't know if there was a 5th hiding inside. Lauren waited a moment, and when no one appeared in the small patch of sunlight underneath the open hatch, she turned to me and nodded. I grabbed my gas-free meter, a yellow machine the size of my hand, and lowered the instrument into the vessel. Excited to climb inside and look around, I anxiously waited 30 seconds. If the machine detected the presence of toxic gases or dangerously low levels of oxygen, then it would flash red with a blaring audible alarm. I was a gas-free engineer, one of 3 people on board our Coast Guard ship who was certified to use the meter and deem spaces safe for entry. The machine stayed silent. I only heard the sound of the ocean gently splashing against the sides of the submarine and the idling engine of our small pursuit boat nearby. I told Lauren, "The air's good right here." She holstered her pistol, although danger was still present and she hadn't verified that the space was clear. Lauren and I were stationed aboard the United States Coast Guard cutter Midget, a ship about the length of a football field. She was also my roommate and one of about 20 women in a crew of almost 170 people. Our main mission on that patrol was to catch drug runners in the eastern Pacific Ocean, in a region spanning from Mexico to Ecuador, the equivalent length of the entire United States West Coast. Lauren was the law enforcement officer for our ship, managing the boarding teams and overseeing drug busts. We were coming to the end of a 3-month counter-narcotics patrol, and it would be the last deployment on board Midget for both Lauren and me before we transferred to new units and new jobs. We'd been living together for close to a year in a stateroom 9 feet wide by 12 feet long. It was the only place on the ship that we had any privacy. The room had narrow bunk beds the size of cots, with only enough space to roll over in our sleep, but not sit up. Lauren had the kind of vibrant personality that filled a room the moment she entered it. She was tall and loud, and relished every opportunity for storytelling. When we first became shipboard roommates, I loved having her attention focused on me. Quickly, she'd become one of my best friends, and we'd spent most of our free time hanging out together, on and off the ship. When Lauren found out that one of her roommates in Seattle was planning to move, I offered to help by renting an apartment with her. Just a couple weeks after we'd begun looking at places together, her older brother, who was an international business owner, decided to buy a house in Seattle, although he lived in China. They would get better tax credits with the house in her name because of the first-time buyer laws in place then. Lauren told me that there wasn't room for me in her new 4-bedroom house. She needed younger roommates to sign leases, women in the Coast Guard who were guaranteed to stay in Seattle longer. Lauren prioritized this business decision over our friendship, and she was unapologetic about it. Not only did I lose my best friend in the city, but the stateroom that had once been my sanctuary on board the ship had transformed into a hostile space. I imagined the 4 men locked together inside the semi-sub, breathing the same stale air, and I wondered what they would do if they didn't like each other. They'd probably met immediately before spending that week at sea together, but trapped in a much smaller space without any escape. The men in the sub had a single diesel engine for propulsion, and it had broken down. The vessel had been dead in the water for several days, and the men on board had run out of food. The stranded men called for other smugglers to come rescue them and pick up the cocaine on board, communicating with the smuggling network over the radio in a series of whistles and clicks. Unfortunately for them, U.S. Navy aircraft flying in the area had spotted them first. Our small boats, with armed boarding teams, sped off to apprehend the cocaine sub bobbing in the ocean sub 335 miles from Costa Rica. I clipped the gas-free meter onto the right hip pocket of my coveralls to free my hands. Lauren watched from the starboard side of the hatch as I lowered myself into the sub. I was there to ensure that the vessel was safe for the boarding team to enter. I'd been assigned this job based on my ability to assess the stability of the vessel, having earned a naval engineering degree, and my proven willingness to fit into tight and dangerous spaces. As soon as my boots hit the deck of the vessel with a thump, I glanced at my gas-free meter. The green light flickered methodically, the oxygen level normal. My nose burned with the stench of diesel fuel and human shit, and my eyes watered. I glanced around the compartment, blinking as my eyes adjusted to the dim light. No one else was inside. I could tell in 2 seconds that there was nowhere to hide. I was standing in the largest open area of the sub, the only place with headroom. Most of the space behind the entry hatch was taken up by a diesel engine with tools littered around it. I looked forward from the middle section under the hatch and saw rows of contraband wrapped in burlap bags speckled with dirt. Without looking up, I yelled to Lauren, "Contraband is in the bow of the boat!" I heard her radio the message back to the command on the midget, which floated a few hundred yards away. There was a 5-gallon bucket directly under the hatch with a plank of wood for a lid, and it was obvious that the 4 men had been using it as a toilet. This narco sub was clearly designed for stealth and cargo capacity, not with the comfort of the crew in mind. Standing in the sunlight of the entrance, I was horrified to realize that this vessel didn't have a single viewport. There was no way of seeing what was happening outside the sub once the watertight hatch above was sealed. I imagined piloting this beast blind to the sun, sea, and stars, the digital GPS screen mounted at eye level, my only guide. At night, just the green glow of coordinates and ship speed would light the compartment, faces barely visible. I began to understand why the 4 men had locked themselves inside the vessel the night before, believing that the Coast Guard boarding team was actually a group of competing drug smugglers come to murder them and steal the cocaine. Even in calm seas, the vessel swayed slightly and I paused, remembering that the boat had been dead in the water for days until we'd found it. This was the wet season for the region, and the men in the sub must have experienced the intense storms with pelting rain and 15-foot swells that we'd sailed through that week. Had they seen angry gray clouds on the horizon the previous morning, or only heard the drumming of the droplets on the fiberglass and been rocked by the wind and waves? With their engine inoperable, the men sat seasick inside the narco sub, bobbing in the water like a bloated whale carcass. On board our Coast Guard ship, Lauren and I had stopped talking to each other near the beginning of the 3-month period at sea, entering into an unspoken agreement that we would only discuss matters having to do with work, nothing personal. She would inquire with artificial politeness, "When's your next watch in the engine room?" Or, "When is the next all-hands fire drill?" And I would ask, "Do you have the next watch on the bridge?" Or, "Are you doing this boarding?" Lauren and I had different approaches to our awkward relationship. She wanted the crew to think that we were friends outside of our stateroom, whereas I didn't care if people knew how petty and immature we were. For the first time, I was a willing participant in passive-aggressive behavior, and I didn't want to pretend that we were getting along just for the sake of keeping up professional appearances. Safely on board the midget, I thought about the men in the sub and wondered what past events had brought them together. Why were they so desperate for money that they would risk their lives to transport a haphazard vessel full of cocaine? And what would happen to their families now that they'd been captured? My conflict with Lauren seemed extremely petty compared to their situation. I had yelled up to Lauren, "Moving aft!" and crawled toward the stern along the port side of the diesel engine, climbing over metal parts and rubber exhaust tubing strewn about by someone who clearly didn't know how to fix the engine. Sunlight streamed through patches in the fiberglass hull like a stained glass window, tinted blue from the paint that covered the whole vessel. My right hand clutched the gas-free meter held out in front of my body. I reached up into the corners of the aft compartment from a crouched position. For a split second, I couldn't help but imagine the alarm on my meter beeping incessantly as I scrambled backward frantically, holding my breath. If I wasn't able to get to the clean air of the hatchway before passing out, I knew Lauren would risk her life to jump into the sub to pull me out herself. Despite our strained relationship, I didn't doubt she would ignore protocol and put herself in danger to rescue me. I had to scoot backward feet first to wiggle out of the engine compartment and return to the hatch. I pulled myself upward out of the stuffy air and into the sunlight. "It's safe for the boarding team to go on board," I said to Lauren, "but it's really cramped. I was barely able to squeeze back there myself." I was ushered onto one of our waiting small boats and taken back to the midget to relay my findings to the captain and executive officer. Lauren and her boarding team retrieved one bale from the narco sub weighing 20 kilos to test it for content and purity. They cut away the muddy wrapping and found cocaine bundled tightly in a black plastic garbage bag and duct tape. The boarding team tallied the bales and discovered we had apprehended an estimated 6.6 tons of pure cocaine. All of the cocaine was stored in the bow of the vessel, so removing it would cause some serious stability issues. The craft was now a hazard to navigation, so our captain was ordered to sink it. If we left the narco sub floating there, another ship could accidentally run it over and get damaged. The enlisted men and women in charge of Midget's weapons, the gunner's mates, were given the honor of destroying the vessel with 50 caliber and 25 millimeter machine guns. I stood on the flight deck wearing earmuffs a few yards away from where one of the guns was mounted on the side of the ship. I watched as small patches of the Pacific Ocean jumped 3 feet in the air as the bullets ripped through the narco sub. The blue water slowly consumed the vessel, and it sank. I wondered how many shipwrecks were lying on the ocean floor hundreds of feet below, and how far they had traveled to end up there. As much as I appreciated the ingenuity that had gone into the design and creation of the narco sub, I understood that it wasn't worth saving. I wanted to believe that Lauren and I could repair our friendship, but I knew I didn't have the energy to salvage the relationship. Some things are best left at sea.
That was Tenley Lozano.